Hi there and welcome. My name is Gauthier Choquet and I am a Microsoft Technical Trainer. In this video, we will explore migrating SQL Server workloads to Azure SQL Virtual Machines. This IaaS approach provides full control over the OS and SQL Server instance, allowing for efficient management of high availability and disaster recovery. You will learn how to migrate SQL Server database using tools like the Azure SQL Migration Extension for the Azure Data Studio, the Azure Data Migration Assistant, and the native backup and restore. By the end of this module, you will be equipped to plan and execute migration from on-premise SQL Server to Azure Virtual Machine, addressing both technical and business requirements. So let's get started with our journey to migrate databases to Azure VMs. Throughout this module, we will use an example scenario to explain key data migration concepts. So imagine you're a senior database administrator at a global retail company. You collaborate with consultants and architects to initiate data platform modernization project that meets the organization's technical and business requirement. Your main responsibility is to identify what is needed and migrate many different databases running different versions of SQL Server. The first question would be, do we do an online or an offline migration? The Azure SQL Migration Extension for Azure Data Studio offers two different migration modes, each tailored for different scenarios. The online mode allows for minimal disruption, enabling users to continue accessing the source database for both reading and writing during the migration process. However, it is important to note that this mode is limited to the cutover duration at the end of the migration. The other option is the offline mode. It requires the source database to be in inactive mode for the write operation, resulting in complete downtime of the database until the migration is finalized. This slide also highlights the importance of assessing the suitability for migration, as it recommends the best resources based on existing backup file, whether you store them on a network share or on a blob container in Azure. Understanding this option is important for planning a successful migration. The Data Migration Assistant, or DMA, is a powerful tool designed to facilitate the transition to a SQL Server instance on an Azure virtual machine. It allows for the migration of multiple databases at the same time, which can significantly reduce the downtime and streamline the process of the migration. Additionally, the DMA supports the migration of SQL Server logins, ensuring that the user access is maintained post-migration. It is also important to note that the DMA offers options to fine-tune the behavior, allowing for customization based on specific project and specific needs. This flexibility can help address unique challenges that may arise during the migration process. Let's have a discussion on the whiteboard about the different tools available.
All right, so when we talk about the tooling for the migration is interesting. So multiple tools available. Now, again, those tools have some similarities and some differences as well. So I'm going to be talking about multiple of them. Actually, we're going to be discussing 4 different tools. So the first one, let's talk about the Azure Migrate. Okay, so it's a large tool that combine a set of tools, right? So think about if you have some large scale migration, but then when you want to migrate not only the database itself, but the entire application. So think about multi-tier application, 3-tier application, you could think about this 3-tier application. So with the web front, middle tier, and data tier all on VMs, and then you want to migrate this application to different endpoint or resources on Azure, right? So it's a collection of tools, which is very interesting here. So it's a multi-tool where you can do both the assessment and the migration. Okay, so it's a single tool that can do an end-to-end migration for large-scale application. Okay, very interesting as well. We're not going to really talk about this as part of our scope for our session, okay, but know that and be aware that it's leveraging actually the other tools that we're going to be discussing within our session. As a number 2, I'm going to be placing the Azure migration extension with the Azure Data Studio. All right, so as mentioned, is that Azure migration extension that needs to be enabled as part of the Azure Data Studio, which is interesting. Well, why? Let's see it. So very interesting and optimized for small to medium size database. It would provide the assessment. Okay, the assessment is going to be there. Going to provide the SKU as we saw earlier, the SKU recommendations. Okay, so it's help us to facilitate the migration of SQL server DB to Azure. Okay, and then we support the online or also the offline migration. Okay, so very interesting tool here that we have seen already, and we're actually going to continue to leverage. I'm just going to continue down here. So next one I want to discuss is the DMA, Database Migration Assistant. I'm going to place it here to be aligned. All right, so interesting here for migration of database to Azure. So depending on if you want to migrate to SQL database or even SQL Server on VM, right? Depending the endpoint here, and then it's actually a standalone application. Right, so it's an application that you can install somewhere, and then you create the connection from the source and the destination based on the lookup with the context of the user that you want to use for the migration. It's going to look up what can be done with the permission of the user and do that that migration. It's going to help us to do that migration. And lastly, we're going to be talking about the Azure database migration service. So we're going to go a little bit more into detail as part of that one in a few as well. All right, so very interesting. Why? Help us to do seamless migration. Okay, so step-by-step migration guide is going to help you to potentially point from multiple database sources to Azure. Okay, support also the, extend it here, support the online and offline migration, depending on which one that you want to do. Actually, you will need also to create, we're going to extend on that topic in the few as well, create a self-hosted integration runtime, right? So why? In order to have access from the source SQL Server and then potentially the backup that you have set up here in order to set up the migration here and help you to the migration here. All right, so again, the question of tooling is always a good question to ask. It's like, hey, we have multiple options. Which tool should I use? Well, again, as said multiple times now, Azure does a great job to provide us with options. So depending on the requirement that you have, now we know the difference between some of those tools, and then based on that, I hope that will help you to select the right tool for your scenario. Okay, and with that being said, let's go back to our presentation.
Understanding the distributed availability group is critical for ensuring minimum downtime during migrations. By leveraging the always-on availability group, you can seamlessly transition to a standalone instance of SQL Server or an Azure VM. It is important to note that the Azure Replica Wizard is designed for an Azure virtual machine operating under the classic deployment model. However, best practices are recommended using the Azure Resource Manager for creating virtual machine on Azure. This means that to add a replica, you will need to utilize the T-SQL, which provides greater flexibility and control over the provisioning. The distributed availability group is a great contender for mission-critical workload, as it would limit the downtime during the migrations. Could we just take a backup from our databases, move that backup to Azure, and then just restore it from there? Well, yes, it's often the most straightforward approach, especially for larger databases. This method leverages the Azure Blob Storage, which is designed for scalability and reliability. So it's important to note that it supports the Shared Access Signature, or the SAS, allowing for secure access to the blob, to the storage account, and also accommodate storage keys for page blob scenarios. We could also back up to or restore from a URL with established authentication to make the process easier, but also faster, because you don't have to move the backup file as it is already saved on Azure. The SQL command provided on the screen shows you how to back up a transaction log and restore a full database. Using the no recovery statement during the restoration is needed, because when you're planning to apply differential or even the transaction log backup afterward, you need to ensure that the database remains in a state ready for further update. Thank you for joining me in this module on migrating SQL Server workloads to Azure's virtual machine. We have covered different tools and strategies to ensure a smooth and efficient migration process, and by now, you should have a solid understanding on how to leverage Azure SQL Migration Extension for the Azure Data Studio, the Data Migration Assistant, and other methods like the log shipping or even the transactional replication. Remember, planning is key to a successful migration. With the knowledge gained in this module, you are well equipped to tackle the challenges of migrating SQL Server database to Azure Virtual Machine, ensuring minimum downtime and optimal performance. So thank you for your time and attention, and let's continue to explore the exciting possibilities that Azure offers us for SQL Server workloads.